afternoon. The next panel will be considering education policy. Judge Jennifer Walker Elrod will be the moderator. Jennifer Walker Elrod has served as a circuit judge on the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit since 2007. She is a graduate of Baylor University and Harvard Law. After law school, she clerked for the Honorable Sim Lake in the Southern District of Texas. Before serving as a federal judge, Judge Elrod was appointed and then twice elected judge of the 190th District of Harris County, Texas. Thank you so much for coming and have a wonderful time.
Thank you so much, Abby. And thank you for staying for the last panel of the day. We're what stands between you and the cocktail hour, but I think it's well worth your time. Americans have viewed education as the great social equalizer. However, today, many schools are failing. The disparity is especially stark in inner-city school districts where poor children are most in need of quality education. Is school choice the solution? What role should the federal government play in education? And what legal issues are implicated by reform efforts? We are so delighted to have 4 distinguished scholars here with us to discuss that. First, we have Professor Amy Wax, Professor of Law at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. Professor Wax's work addresses issues in social welfare law and policy, as well as the relationship of the family, the workplace, and labor markets. She has served as the assistant to the Solicitor General in the Office of the Solicitor General at the U.S. Department of Justice, and she has argued 15 cases before the United States Supreme Court. She is well published in this and other areas. Welcome, Professor Wax. Our next speaker today is Ms. Cynthia Brown, Senior Fellow, Center for American Progress. She was previously the Vice President for Education Policy at American Progress and formerly served as the Director of the Renewing Our Schools, Securing Our Future National Task Force on Public Education. She has spent more than 35 years working in a variety of professional positions addressing high-quality, equitable public education. Welcome, Ms. Brown. Our next speaker has a new title. We welcome the Honorable Clint Bullock, Justice on the Arizona Supreme Court. Prior to serving as a justice on the Arizona Supreme Court, Justice Bolick was the vice president for litigation at the Goldwater Institute and has co-founded the Institute of Justice and later served as president of the Alliance for School Choice. He was named one of the 90 greatest D.C. lawyers in the past 30 years and has won the Bradley Prize in 2006 for advancing the values of democratic capitalism. He is also well published, and we're very glad to have him today. Thank you, Justice Bolick. And our final speaker is doing double duty, and I think he should get applause just for that. Dr.
It's actually my evil twin you see before you.
Well, hopefully he'll be entertaining. Dr. William Galston is the chair in governance studies at the Brookings Institute. He was deputy assistant for domestic policy to U.S. President Bill Clinton, and he has been involved as the founding member of the board of the National Campaign to Prevent Teen Pregnancy and is chair of the campaign's task force on religion and public values. He's been a journey, a foray at the University of Texas, and so I feel like we're kindred spirits as he passed through there. He has written on questions of political and moral philosophy. He is well published, and we could go on at length about his publications as well. Welcome, Dr. Galston. Professor Wax has decided to start us off.
I didn't make that decision, so I beg off on that one. So I do face this initial choice of whether I should sit or stand, and I think that the behavioral cognitive people could have a field day sort of weighing up the pros and cons of either approach here, and there's a gender aspect to it and everything, but I've decided that I would probably be more commanding if I stand. I'm going to sit because of the fact that I can barely see here, and deliver my remarks from right here. So thank you for inviting me to this wonderful student symposium and this panel. I taught for 8 delightful years at UVA Law, and I'm very glad to be back, and especially at a Federalist Society function. The Federalist Society, with which I am intimately associated at Penn, is really a wonderful organization. My charge here is to consider this question of how education can help alleviate some of the growing inequalities that characterize our society. And this is an enormous charge for the 10 to 12 minutes that I have been allocated. There are so many aspects and facets to this topic. Education starts from the moment we are born, and hopefully it continues until we go back to where we came from. We can talk about preschool, about school, about college. It's really many endless choices here, and I will in a moment tell you what choice I have made. But we can hardly be unaware that disparities in educational achievement by socioeconomic status, by class, and also importantly by race have long existed and are still a stubborn feature of our national life. Many different approaches to closing some of these gaps have been suggested, discussed, attempted over many decades, generating a rich empirical and theoretical literature on the topic, but unfortunately, none has so far proven very successful, despite decades of effort and large expenditures of money at all levels of government and in the private sector. So in order to take on this huge topic, I have decided to focus on a specific issue, a kind of microcosm for what is happening in our society and some of the conflicts and fissures and fault lines that have opened up over education. And I'm going to contrast 2 specific approaches to addressing educational inequalities that have recently received a lot of play in the elementary and secondary school education sphere, so that is going to be my focus, for alleviating the gaps that we are all vexed about. So what are these 2 approaches? One approach that's been around for a while and I think has increased in popularity is what I would term the mixing or integrationist approach. The second is more recent and has had a number of proponents, and I will call that the active acculturation approach. So I'm going to discuss as briefly as possible these 2 approaches. So what is the integrationist tack? Well, anybody who studies law like you do is familiar with the long and very vexed history of desegregation efforts, which historically have been focused and concentrated on eliminating racial segregation in our schools, and specifically targets the unequal educational fortunes of blacks and whites. But there is also another aspect to desegregation, which is integration by income or class in recognition of the differences in outcomes along lines of socioeconomic status, or SES. I'll call it SES. Racial integration has, of course, a long and tangled history. I'm not going to dwell on it. Suffice it to say that for both legal and practical reasons, attempts to create sustained racial integration in our K-12 education system has largely failed. Schools today are not significantly less racially polarized than, say, 50 years ago, and many, many students go to school predominantly with individuals of the same race. As a remedy for past official racial discrimination, judicial efforts to integrate schools have foundered on many factors. It's a complex story, but these include changing demographics and housing patterns, because, as we'll see, schools exist primarily in neighborhoods, the fervor and the popularity for localism in education, and finally, the failures of what I would call government by decree. That is, the inability of courts to run and control the sprawling and complex educational establishment by judicial fiat. And I think it's fair to say that history has proven this to be an untenable project. Perhaps other people will disagree. In addition, racial integration in its non-remedial forms, that is through voluntary race-conscious efforts by local governments or school districts, have also run into severe legal headwinds. And here I am talking about the Seattle School District and Louisville School District recent cases, in which the Supreme Court severely restricted governmental discretion to remedy societal discrimination or generate school diversity for its own sake through race-conscious school assignments and the manipulation of the racial composition of schools. So there is definitely sort of something like a brick wall here. Given these difficulties, local attempts to integrate schools by social class as opposed to race have emerged as a kind of rearguard action, a way to improve the chances of low-income students by mixing them with more advantaged students, more affluent students, perhaps more palatable under current legal standards, and I think, in fact, more acceptable. This approach has been advocated by a number of key proponents: James Ryan, formerly of this law school, now the dean of the Harvard Ed School, Richard Kallenberg of the Century Foundation, have pushed this approach. It does have some social science behind it, although, as with all social science, it also has its detractors. And several localities, including Wake County outside Raleigh, North Carolina, and most recently New York City, and there have been a number of articles in the New York Times about this, have tried this approach. Now, although class integration sounds like a good idea that nobody can really be opposed to in theory, it's actually extremely difficult to bring about and sustain in practice. And to understand these obstacles requires considering and really thinking through why the proponents favor income integration in the first place. Why is it that they think that moving low-income students into quote-unquote higher, more affluent SES districts is a good idea? Why do that? According to James Ryan in his book on income integration, which, full disclosure, I have reviewed in detail, the benefits of income integration depend on recognizing a couple of things. First, on recognizing distinct cultures by class. This is really a self-conscious argument about class SES divisions in culture, outlook, attitude, and also on believing in a particular dynamic of group behavior, right, that results when certain students are exposed to a superior culture, right? So in well-off suburban schools, Ryan claims the culture is more often one of rigor, order, achievement, pro-social behavior. Children are well socialized to learning and to meet mainstream social expectations, and parents are involved in demanding and supporting those norms. And all this results in higher standards and an atmosphere conducive to learning. Second, in schools, as in other group settings, participants tend to conform to the dominant culture. So according to Ryan, the school environment is contagious. If you place students who are in some way deficient into mainstream schools, you will raise their aspirations and their motivation. Now, a moment's thought reveals that problems arise in the potentially negative element that accompanies this account. Implicit in this paradigm is a rather unflattering inference. Disadvantaged children, given their upbringing and background, fall short in attitudes and behavior, needed to achieve success in school and life. They need to be socialized to more functional habits and norms. This requires sending them to a school that is predominantly middle class in demography or upper class. Now, before addressing the problematic nature of these assumptions, and I'm not necessarily saying they're invalid, I'm saying they're socially problematic and run into headwinds, I do want to note one big impediment to income integration, which is simply practical and is related to this, and that is rooted in some important American commitments. Maintaining income integration in schools entails a great deal of intrusive, centralized, bureaucratic control to maintain the optimal mix and balance of poor and affluent students. If poor children become too numerous, they will shift the culture in the wrong direction. Affluent students can't be allowed to crowd them out completely, so there's constant juggling and rejuggling of the school population and manipulation of the demography. This generates unpredictability, instability in the lives of families and neighborhoods. Neighborhood schools have to be broken up. Children have to travel long distances. This degree of bureaucratic control will breed resentment and anxiety. It has bred those and creates a great deal of dislocation that undermines the cohesion and the communal loyalty that promotes strong schools in the first place. So we already have an obstacle course here. But I want to go back to what I consider the most important obstacle to the success of income integration, which that its basic predicate runs into delicate cultural taboos that tend to impede candor and effective implementation. I only have 2 minutes left, that's amazing. Income integration is paternalistic, and it's also somewhat patronizing, right? It assumes the superiority of mainstream or upper SES culture and that there's some kind of deficiency. Now, this is in tension with important strands of progressive thinking, that's a broad label, but I think it's valid, about the sources of poverty and educational disparities. That disadvantaged children are impeded by unjust, external, larger cultural and structural forces, and not by any deficiency within them, that amounts to victim blaming, right? And of course, the whole uplift by osmosis standard is also predicated on the notion that children exposed to better values will adopt them. And this, I think, is something that a lot of people in our society question. There's one area, I think, in which the rubber meets the road here, and that is in mixed schools, which are engineered to be integrated by social class. Problems arise with the standards of school discipline and the penalties that will be imposed for violations of standards of behavior. And social scientists do accept that, on average, lower SES children are more likely to violate those behavioral norms and pose behavioral problems. This runs smack up against the Obama administration's initiative to flatten out the rates of school discipline by race primarily and by class. So we have an attempt to integrate and socialize children to middle and upper middle class norms, but we have this imperative not to be too hard on them in disciplinary standards. Ultimately, this causes affluent parents whose voluntary participation is essential, because in this country we cannot ultimately force people to go to school with people they don't want to go to school with. That's sort of fundamental and bedrock. That really creates, I think, a lot of opposition and disgruntlement, and of course that disgruntlement often cannot be openly expressed because individuals are being selfish, they're accused of stereotyping and bigotry. So the discussion really comes to a halt, which produces a frustrating cultural paradox. Parents are made to feel reluctant to give expression to the very assumptions about class differences that underlie the integrationist model in the first place. Now, because I have about 50 seconds left, I want to just say a little bit about the acculturation model, which is, I think, based on similar suppositions, but is very different. So here I'm referring to some highly specialized schools, usually set up as charter schools like Success Academy, KIPP Academy, Harlem Children's Zone. And the hallmark of these schools is the creation of a wraparound, structured, directive environment that seeks to upgrade the cognitive skills, the attitude, the outlook, and the habits of poor disadvantaged children to assimilate them to more middle-class norms. The KIP motto, work hard, be nice, is sort of a shorthand for this effort. Now, the acculturation model shares with the income integration model a degree of paternalistic and even patronizing understandings about the cultural fissures that exist in our society across social classes. But I think that the acculturation model has advantages. It has its own pragmatic obstacles because it runs against the teachers' union's bureaucratization of the way schools are run. It's run on a more flexible model. But I think it has the advantage of being more upfront and more frank and more open about these cultural differences and being more candid about what it's seeking to accomplish, which is not passively through osmosis and absorption, but rather through active teaching and example setting and insistence that students conform to behavioral and academic standards. So for myself, I favor the acculturation model over the passive integration model. I think it's more effective. Now, the problem, of course, is that that model, like the integration model, sits very uneasily with some strands of political and of thought, primarily political and ideological thought in our society, which really feels very uneasy with recognizing these cultural differences and setting one culture up as superior, the one that everybody should aspire to. So that definitely is out there. That is a divide that I think needs resolution and discussion if we are going to make progress educating the least advantaged children and develop a viable model for those children in public schools, perhaps in a private offshoot, in charter schools, or in whatever context we choose to educate our children. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me. As you saw, if you looked at my bio, you'd see that I've spent my entire career working on education equity and education reform. I'm mostly retired now, but I do keep up on everything and I'm still active. I just want to say I'm fascinated by Professor Wax's comments. I really appreciated them. My first job in the late 60s was as an investigator for the federal government, Office for Civil Rights, looking at segregated schools. And later on, in the Carter administration, I became Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights and spent even more time working on the issues she's discussing. And now I'm the president of a charter school board. So I've sort of traveled her route. But that's not what I'm going to talk about. Because I only have a few minutes, I'm focusing my remarks on recent developments, namely the reauthorization of the 1965 Elementary and Secondary Education Act, now called the Ensuring Student Success Act, or ESSA for short. You knew the law as No Child Left Behind, and it was finally reauthorized in December on a bipartisan basis after 14 years. Most people are celebrating ESSA, but does this new law that is supposed to assist low-income, educationally disadvantaged students do any more than its predecessor? And I think not. Yes, ESSA offers positive improvements over NCLB, but virtually nothing was done to address long-standing fundamental challenges to improving the achievement of low-income and minority students confined to low-performing schools. There is silence on the inequitable financing of public schools nationwide, a finance system that renders the U.S. an outlier among developed countries. And there is little but new semantics about ensuring the hiring and assignment of high-quality teachers and school leaders to every school and about appropriately training them. Together with weakened accountability requirements, as opposed to sensible reforms, and unprecedented constraints on the Secretary of Education, the law looks to me more like the Improving America School Act of 1994 than a forward-looking law for a new century. It virtually enshrines states' rights, a governance structure with mostly negative history in guaranteeing equal educational opportunities. There are bright spots around data reporting, and especially important is a new requirement that federal, state, and local expenditures, broken down by personnel and non-personnel costs, be reported publicly at the school level. There will be a lot of good data for researchers. I'll come back to that in a minute. While I'll be discussing the shortcomings and missed opportunities of ESSA, all is not lost. There are very important lawsuits directed at improving education working their way through state and federal courts. And since NCLB was enacted in 2002, state education advocacy organizations, all of which are bipartisan, have formed and found strong voices in 31 states. Such advocates will need to engage in intense efforts to make sure ESSA is well implemented. In theory, holding states responsible for providing high-quality education for all students makes some sense. This is a huge country, and operating a national school system is not possible in practical terms. But just because the U.S. is so big is no reason not to have national enforceable standards for operating a fair system of public education nationwide. Of course, federal civil rights laws enacted in the 60s and 70s provide important guarantees against discrimination, but there is no law prohibiting discrimination based on income status. In practical terms, that means the Federal Office for Civil Rights can act if schools are funded inequitably based on the racial or ethnic makeup of the student body, but it is helpless if funding is inequitable based solely on poverty level of students' families. ESEA, now ESSA, has never had such a limitation. It directs funds through states to schools with high concentrations of low-income students. But sadly, it does little to guarantee, as a condition of receiving those extra federal funds, that high-poverty schools get their fair share of state and local funds. Under ESSA, state education agencies have major responsibilities. These agencies, called SEAs, vary widely in capacity and commitment to quality and equity. Their effectiveness is often dependent on the quality of their leadership, and tragically, there's very frequent turnover in chief state school officers. On average, now they serve 1 year. At least for 2 decades, most state legislatures have reduced funding for SEAs. Indeed, a well-kept secret, rarely documented because of the opaqueness of state education budgets, is that the federal government pays, on average, about 50% of the costs of running the SEAs. Of course, it only pays around 10% for local and school district costs. In exchange for federal dollars, SEAs have been required, at least since 1965, to do certain things. But actions by the Obama administration's Department of Education requiring certain things led in 2015 to using ESSA to cut back the department's powers to do so in the future. There was a tremendous backlash from a large range of groups on both the right and left over requirements for high standards, annual testing, teacher evaluations with consideration of students' test score gains, identification of low-performing schools, and state plan waivers, among others. There's no doubt that the Obama administration was aggressive in pushing for education change, and it had to do this in the context of an eventually outdated NCLB that needed a redo. It also was very opportunistic in using a substantial pot of education money created by Congress in response to a severe recession. The latter, the over $4 billion 2008 race to the top competition among states for grants of several $1 million apiece, triggered unprecedented positive state legislative action. Despite major pushback against the demands of that program and NCLP state plan waivers, much of the state reform legislation and policy still remains in place, particularly around teacher evaluations. I concede that there have been some poor decisions made by the administration. The department was inconsistent in its judgments about state accountability systems. It pushed hard for turning around low-performing schools, but with some questionable requirements and uneven success. It successfully put the issue of teacher evaluation on the actionable agenda of all states and districts, but it was slow to recognize how difficult it is to design an effective evaluation system. These design efforts are still a work in progress. There are already ominous signs of states sliding backwards on accountability and teacher evaluations. For example, in late 2015, New York Press reported the state was about to support elimination of student test scores and teacher evaluations until at least 2018. Such actions are likely to spread to other states with strong teacher union voice. Just as bad is the very dismal picture for state education funding. The Center on Budget and Policy Priorities reported in January that, and I quote, at least 31 states provided less state funding per pupil in the 2014 school year than it did in the 2008 school year before the recession took hold. And at least 15 states, the cuts exceeded 10%. Worse than giving states a free hand in complying with the mostly weak ESSA requirements was the congressional failure to act on the inequitable school funding found nationwide. In short, schools with the most low-income students receive the least amount of funding, and this phenomenon works in three ways. First, the greatest gaps in education funding occur among the poorest states. They are in the South and Southwest. Studies have estimated that it would take about a 40% increase in federal funding to equalize spending among states, that even taking in costs, into account costs. The likelihood that Congress would do that anytime soon is nil. A second issue is the way that states distribute their funds to school districts. Lawsuits and research studies have documented the inadequate funding of school districts with substantial concentrations of low-income and minority students. A few states like Massachusetts and New Jersey are relatively fair, and California recently took a major step forward. But funding inequity remains in most states. And the main culprit is the often large number of school districts, many small, and the reliance on property taxes to fund them, which locks in differences in wealth among communities. Finally, there is the issue of how districts distribute funds among the schools, among their schools. Today, most large school districts do not allocate state and federal funds equitably in real dollars to high poverty and low poverty schools. They ignore the greater needs of students from low-income families who need extra investments in their education and related supports in order to achieve the outcomes of more affluent students. The federal government is complicit in this practice because of a weak provision in Title I of ESSA that in theory requires comparable per pupil funding between poor and non-poor schools before the ESSA funds can be spent in high poverty schools. But this provision contains a big loophole by exempting teacher salaries from the funding calculations. And we know that the higher paid teachers are in the more affluent schools. One good note is that the requirement for reporting actual personnel and non-personnel expenditures by school will provide researchers with a trove of data to analyze. And just maybe the reporting and local analysis of this data will encourage district and state officials to take action to rectify this funding inequity. Finally, let me just say that bringing about equitable funding would not solve all finance problems. Money must be spent well, and we have a lot of documentations about poor ways education money has also been spent, but I don't have time to go into that right now. In the end, ESSA is a major bipartisan accomplishment by Congress, but it is also a significant missed opportunity to further equal educational opportunity in the in the United States. One wonders how long it will take Congress before once again it moves forward in this challenge that has been really with our country since its founding.
As a recovering litigator, I speak best from behind a podium. First, I'd like to thank you all for being here. Judge Elrod, I will never forget that brief introduction because it's the first time in 33 years of being a lawyer that I have been introduced as honorable. Truly a memorable moment. I want to put in a very brief word. For those of you who are considering clerkships after law school, please consider state Supreme Courts and courts of appeals. There are some really cool things going on out in the states, and my chambers will be accepting applications for the term beginning in 2017 this summer. And I have to tell you, anyone who can survive a summer in Arizona can survive anything. So test yourselves out. To start with some audience participation, I'd like to see the hands of everyone in the room who lives in a place that has crummy public schools. Good number of you. I'd like to see a show of hands of how many of you live in the United States. I hate to tell you this, but the answer to the second question is also the answer to the first question. Our educational system, our K-12 educational system, is a national catastrophe. Many, if not most, of the public schools we think of as good or excellent are in fact, by international comparisons, average or poor. By comparison with Shanghai, China, just to give you an example, we have about 25 public schools in the United States, 25 in the entire United States, that outperform the average public school in Shanghai, China. When we compare ourselves to the other OECD countries who are our competitors in the world, we are either at the midpoint or the bottom half of educational performance in every area of education. The country closest to us in terms of academic performance is Poland. I have nothing against Poland, but it's Poland, and we've got to aspire to be better than Poland. The thing about Poland is that it spends half as much money on K-12 education per student than the United States does. So we pay twice as much to get half the outcome. Of course, the situation is especially dire for low-income kids. Nearly half of Black and Hispanic kids drop out of school before they graduate. When you think about that, if you don't even have a high school graduation, what are your prospects in life? Even kids from affluent suburban public schools go to college, and the first thing they are required to do is to take remedial English because they are barely literate. And we think that we can take care of these problems with programs like affirmative action. As a cab driver once told me, the problem is not in college, the problem is in kindergarten. All of this is especially perverse given the fact that we have the capacity in this country right now to deliver a high-quality education customized to every individual child at a fraction of the cost of which we are providing it, and yet we are not doing that. Many of you are probably familiar with the Khan Academy, a school, so to speak, that takes place entirely over the internet, free classes in mathematics and sciences and so forth, and they're just head-spinning. Thousands, if not millions of kids, and for that matter adults, have learned through the Khan Academy. We have charter schools that are absolutely eye-popping in their success, not just for high-performing students, but for low-income kids as well. A lot of times people, good-intentioned people say, well, we just need to lower class sizes, we need to send more money to the classroom to facilitate that. Well, when you think about it, what is the ideal student-teacher ratio? Is it 12 to 1, 15 to 1, 18 to 1? What if you have a teacher like Jaime Escalante, possibly the most gifted math teacher in American history? Should he have 18 kids a class, 20 kids a class? We have the capacity today to deliver that type of education to millions of kids, and yet we are not doing that. The reason we are not doing that is that our education system is a 19th century education system. If Abraham Lincoln came back today, hopefully he wouldn't run for the Republican nomination because I'm sure he'd get bulldozed, but if he did, he would recognize almost nothing about our country, but the one thing he would recognize instantly is our schools, because they are structured largely the same way they were in the late 1800s, with rows of kids being talked to by their teachers in school districts where they attend school because of their zip code and so forth. Given the breadth of our education crisis, we have to start asking whether a particular reform program is not too radical, but rather, is it radical enough? We need a fundamental reconstruction of our K-12 school system, including a devolution of power and resources to the schools and to the families. For instance, why in the 21st century do we have school districts? That question has probably never been posed to you before, and you probably never even thought about it. Why do we have school districts? Some of them are so large that they are impermeable bureaucracies. Some are so small that they couldn't possibly capture economies of scale. They siphon off massive amounts of money without delivering a commensurate educational productivity. They are prone to capture by special interest groups, and they perpetuate funding inequity through property taxes. Well, I think we need to think about bold systemic reforms like that. And for most of the remainder of my brief time, I want to talk to you about one reform that I think has huge potential. Oh God, did I actually just say that word? That has large potential. I honestly, that really was a Freudian slip. To transform American education, and it's called education savings accounts. It is an idea that I am proud to say was born in my former organization, the Goldwater Institute, and it was born of necessity. Goldwater had pushed school vouchers and had helped get a program passed for disabled kids and foster kids in Arizona. It was struck down by the Arizona Supreme Court under the so-called Blaine Amendment, which we could talk about during the Q&A period. A number of states have these. And the court concluded that because the money and vouchers could only go to private schools, that it violated this super protection against separation of church and state. In any event, that got us thinking at the Goldwater Institute, what if we had a program of school choice that did not just allow you to choose private schools? And the idea of education savings accounts was born. And this is how they work. If you're an eligible student, the state will take 90% of what it would have spent on your education and instead put it into an education savings account that you own and control. You can then use it for any educational expense, from private school tuition to distance learning to technology to tutoring, to purchasing discrete services or classes in your local public school, to community college classes, to transportation. And one really nifty aspect of it, if you don't use all of the money, you can save it for college. This idea started in Arizona. It was adopted for the same two groups of students that had the vouchers, the foster kids and disabled kids. It was upheld under the Blaine Amendment by the same courts that had struck down the school vouchers, and it was soon on the move, first to Florida, which also had struck down vouchers and upheld education savings accounts. Tennessee, Mississippi, and Nevada recently became the first state to adopt universal education savings account, every student in Nevada is eligible for an education savings account if they choose to have it. The benefits of this program are potentially enormous. First of all, they cut out the middleman in education. They cut out the educational bureaucracy. It is just like so many other things in our society where you can directly purchase the types of educational services that you want for your child. You can customize them because not every child needs the exact same things. They're especially good for kids with special needs, like kids with disabilities that often require special education. They facilitate the delivery of technology, the purchase and delivery of technology. They eliminate the power of self-interested special interests in the educational arena, and they are a way of saving for college. They also are ultimately equitable because every child gets the same amount of money unless they have special needs in which they get more. The program is under legal challenge in Nevada. It will be very interesting to see what happens there. I am predicting that if things happen, if things are upheld, if the program is upheld, it will continue to move to other states. And I think that this will be the first truly 21st century system of K-12 education that really exists from a public policy standpoint. A final comment, and a very important one. The realm of the possible in terms of education reform is bound ultimately by the United States Supreme Court. When my colleagues and I argued the Zellman case in 2002, which upheld school vouchers by the resounding vote of 5-4, the dissenters in that case warned that if the voucher program was upheld, we would see religious strife, the likes of which we had not seen since Bosnia and Northern Ireland. That was their prediction, and I'm not exaggerating that at all. Well, we have come to see that that obviously has not happened, and I hope that that if the issues of school choice go to the U.S. Supreme Court, that a more contemporary perspective will apply. But this is an area where you as lawyers can make an enormous difference, whether it is being on a school board, being on a charter school board, being a lawyer for schools or education reform groups. This is an area where you can make an enormous difference, and our nation's future depends upon the engagement of each and every one of us. I want to finish with a very quick tribute to Antonin Scalia. In the Zellman case, my opposite number from the National Education Association, a very good lawyer named Bob Channon, was arguing against the voucher program and its constitutionality, and he said, if only the school districts had more money, then this problem would not, we wouldn't need to even talk about vouchers. And Scalia, in the way that only Justice Scalia could get to the absolute heart of the problem, leaned back and said, it's not a money problem, it's a monopoly problem. I think that truer words have not been spoken. We will miss him enormously, but it falls to the rest of us to carry the standard to improve our nation's schools and educational opportunities. Thank you very much for having me today.
So I just proceed? Yep. Well, Judge Bullock did utter a forbidden word, but he was hopelessly retro in his pronunciation. As everybody knows, the word begins with a Y and not an H. Well, you know, my remarks on this panel will be a continuation of the remarks that my virtuous twin treated you to in the previous panel. I'm going to draw sustenance from the same report that I mentioned the last time around, a report a joint product of the American Enterprise Institute and the Brookings Institution entitled Opportunity, Responsibility, and Security, a consensus plan for reducing poverty and restoring the American dream. And this report, as I mentioned before, is the joint work of scholars across a very broad ideological spectrum. And they reached an agreement not only on core principles, but also on some basic facts about where we are now, on the basis of which they tried to construct evidence-based public policy that people across partisan and ideological lines could endorse. And in education elsewhere, they made substantial progress. So let me just channel this report for the next 10 minutes or so with a few introductory remarks. As many of you know, and as some of you with gray hair have lived through, we have been through succession after succession, wave after wave of education reform since the publication of the report Nation at Risk, I believe in 1982, early in the Reagan administration. I am not one of those who believes that these waves of reform have yielded no results whatsoever. I think we are in, by various measures, a better place in public education than we were more than 3 decades ago when this started. I also think it's fair to say that the results have been more modest than a lot of the optimists hoped. And it is certainly time to take a deep breath and to focus on evidence-based public policies to improve the nation's K-12 education that are broadly supported. Let me begin by citing 2 of the many facts that these scholars were able to agree on. Fact number 1, there are huge gaps between poor and non-poor children before children ever present themselves for the first day of kindergarten. We know that, and we know a lot about the reasons why. For that reason, and secondly, by themselves, schools, however reformed, are not going to find it easy, and I would say not going to find it possible to close the gap. Education reform, to be effective, has to go hand in hand with other public policy reforms. Otherwise, we will be expecting too much out of our system of schools. And this is a mistake I think that liberals and conservatives and libertarians all make all too often. We expect better education to be a silver bullet remedy for a host of social and economic ills, and I submit that that is an impossible wish. So we have to be optimistic, but at the same time modest about and realistic about what education reform can accomplish, and we have to be clear about what needs to be added to it. So let me give you some thoughts in this vein. Based on the following fact, poor children and non-poor children arrive at the threshold of public education between a year and a year and a half separated in basic attainment. During the 12 years of K-12 education, that gap about doubles. And I don't think that's an accident. If we don't do more to reduce the gap that opens up in the first 3 or 4 years of a child's life, it is unrealistic to believe that most schools, most of the time, are going to be able to do much better than maintaining that gap rather than allowing it to expand through the K-12 education process. And so, and here I'm going to sound like a hopeless liberal, except this is based on solid evidence. We need to do things like the following before kids ever get to school. We need to improve We need to improve the quality of childcare for lower income families. We need, as I mentioned earlier, to take seriously the evidence about the long-term effectiveness of home visiting programs like the Nurse-Family Partnership, which, as I mentioned in the previous panel, has long-term effects. And building on very, very successful state-based models in Georgia and Oklahoma, we need to expand, I would say, universalize access for poor and low-income children to receive a high-quality pre-K experience. Those three changes at the threshold of public education would be, it seems to me, a significant step forward. Point number two, when we get there, I work, although I do not quite live, in the District of Columbia, which has one of the highest densities of charter schools in the entire country. Obviously not as dense as New Orleans, where the charter schools, for all practical purposes, have replaced a traditional model. But the enrollment of kids in charter and traditional public schools in Washington, D.C. is about on a par. And Washington has had more than a decade of experience. And it turns out that if you are rigorous about administering a charter school system so that high standards of quality are expected and the evidence is reviewed and failing and non-compliant charter schools are put out of their misery before they do a lot of damage to kids, you can achieve very, very good results. And I think there's evidence that not only the DC charter schools pretty good on average, but the fact that they are there as a massive competitor for the public school system has helped the public school system up its game in all sorts of ways. And this issue of charter schools should not be an ideological debate between liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans. Too often it is. We should be guided by the evidence on the ground as to what is working and what isn't. With regard to another possibility, which Professor Wax discussed in some detail, socioeconomic integration, I think the evidence of the benefits for lower income kids who participate in more socioeconomically integrated schools is pretty hard to argue with. On the other hand, the last thing we want to do is create an enormous bureaucratic compliance mechanism, filled with goals, timetables, and review mechanisms and administered by courts or the civil rights, the Civil Rights Office of the Department of Education. We ought to think very seriously about the sorts of programs that some states have already initiated, namely public school choice across district lines, so that if you're a poor family in the District of Columbia, you have a wide range of choices in Montgomery County and Prince George's County, and perhaps Arlington, Virginia as well. There are a number of states that have used extended public school choice to reasonably good effect. Another thing I think we need to do is to initiate a national campaign to reduce to an absolute minimum the incidence of high school dropout rates. There are some cities where the dropout rate for African Americans and Latinos is as high as 50%. Across the country, it's about 1 in 5, according to the latest statistics. But that's many too many, because leaving school before you have a high school diploma in the 21st century is an economic death sentence. I'm stating that just as bluntly as possible. And if you do the numbers, 1 in 5 African Americans and Latinos amounts to hundreds of thousands of kids, and we're allowing this to happen year after year. And if you look at the population of our nation's prisons, it overwhelmingly is made up of high school dropouts. I don't think that is an accidental correlation. So we could kill two birds with one stone, or at least wound a lot of birds with one stone, if we, if we paid some, if we viewed it as an urgent national project to reduce to an absolute minimum over the next 10 years the high school dropout rate, reduce it by at least half. I think that is a feasible goal, and we ought to address ourselves to it. How much time do I have left? 2 minutes. Perfect. Let me make three other policy suggestions in conclusion, or at least policy points. First of all, whatever the contestation about the Common Core, and I deeply regret that it has become embroiled in partisan controversy, there is no serious argument with the proposition that a robust core curriculum in our public schools has done a lot of good compared to where we were in 1982, and could do considerably more good. I'm not going to get into the argument about who's responsible for creating it and administering it, but states that do not have a robust core curriculum are paying a big price for that failure. And as long as we can agree on that, then we can get to work at the state level and the local level. Point number two, and here again I repeat a point that I made earlier. High school-based career and technical education could do a lot for kids, and a lot for the high school dropout rate, and a lot for our economy. And I understand why vocational education 20th century style was discarded before the world became overrun with birdhouses. But at the same time, there is a 21st century version that has succeeded where it has been implemented. And finally, talking about opportunity for the future, there's no question about the fact that without either some advanced technical training or a college degree, your chances of really prospering in the 21st century economy are not bright. We don't have unlimited funds, and to the extent that public funds are devoted to helping students in higher education, I think it's just common sense to concentrate more of those funds on the kids who need them the most, and then have a big argument with kids from families like mine about whether or not they should cling to college subsidies at the expense of much needier students. So with that, I shall subside.
As we discussed before we began the panel, there are lots of areas of agreement. This is not one of those types of issues that you see at some of these conferences, that there are strong divides and there are no areas of agreement. As luck would have it, I had the privilege of teaching 7th grade Texas history yesterday at the one of the KIPP academies in Houston, Texas. And the students, they worked hard and they played nice. They listened. They were the most respectful, they were so respectful to the visiting teachers who taught them about the rule of law. And also, I've had the privilege of serving as the General Counsel for Communities in Schools, which helps students get the social services they need so that the teachers can concentrate on teaching, but the students have the shoes and this and that and the other, so that that's not a hindrance to them getting to school. We know a lot of these things that are so helpful. What are the barriers that keep us from being able to just replicate and offer large varieties of helpful things? That's my question for the panel.
Well, I want to be a bit of a skunk at the party here and identify some villains. So just to, there are a bunch of them. I mean, there's a whole laundry list, but just to start, nobody said anything about teachers' unions and ed schools. I think teachers' unions, I'm not an anti-union person. I think there was a time and a place where unions were very important in our history. I think that maybe they've outlived their usefulness in a lot of ways, but teachers' unions have really stood in the way of many changes and many reforms that are potentially very positive and helpful. My personal view is that the entire government-run public school system, except in a few isolated places, should be blown up and we should start over again. So anything that circumvents or subverts the public school system, I'm all for it, all right? The second villain, and I won't go into elaborate detail, is the ed schools. So there is this ideology, there is this strange dogma, these politicized notions and bad ideas about what people ought to be taught, how they ought to be taught, a suspiciousness towards hierarchy and authority of teachers and everybody else, really. I mean, it has very deep roots. I would say it's the long tail of the 1960s, and it has pervaded every corner of our society to some extent, including families, unfortunately, but especially schools. And I have been studying school discipline and all the contradictory currents that are swirling about on what we expect from students and whether we can make those expectations stick. And I'm just telling you, there's a huge amount of confusion and silliness in this area. So, I think we could blow up the ed schools while we're at it. Subvert and undermine and start over in that. So those are two little ideas I'm throwing out
You're
here.
not controversial at all.
What's wrong with the system?
So I agree with her. But the problem is...
I'm so disappointed.
No, we all pretty much agree, although I'm not sure I agree with education savings accounts because I don't know enough about them. But everything else you said till that I did. But here's the problem. How do you get from here to there? I think it's ridiculous we have school districts, these little teeny ones that talk about inefficiency and expenditures, duplication of central administrations, and all sorts of other stuff. It's a waste of money. But this whole notion of local control, you can have local schools, but you could at least send the money from the states. You could do things you don't have to regulate what goes on in the schools in the states, but you could get the money out there. But how you get from here to there is another thing. The thing about schools of education, they are cash cows for universities. And here's the dirty secret of schools of ed. Their lobbyists have gone in, and you required for teacher certification, you have to have advanced credits. The average teacher in this country has a master's degree. And so it doesn't cost, so they have to go to a university and pay tuition and get more coursework into the university coffers. And then it subsidizes the tenured philosophy department or the engineering department, which I'm totally in favor of. In this country, we do not have a notion that you should pay different amounts for your college education based on the cost of providing it. We do not.
We do at UVA. Engineering students get charged extra.
Okay, there needs to be, but that's not true at public universities. And so the School of Ed is underwriting the rest of the university and producing low-quality teachers. I'm a big charter school advocate, but I think the biggest problems we have in education is the financing thing, as I said, but also the quality of teachers. And while I agree with theory, what you said, the way we produce teachers as opposed to the way Shanghai produces teachers, and I have done some studies of Shanghai, we aren't going to get there. So I think the big challenge is how we get from here to there. I frankly don't think we have much disagreement. And that you could say the same thing about Bill Galston's comments about the additional services we need at early years, how we're ever going to get people to vote to pay for them. So.
Okay, so the big mystery is how to get from here to there, which is, do you have a comment? And then
Very briefly, because I definitely want us to get to the questions. I do think that education savings accounts are a major way of getting there because empowering consumers to make decisions in their own best interests is 180 degrees from where our current system is, and would have a real shockwave effect on the system. One other thing is bringing people into the classrooms to teach outside of the normal ways of doing it. Teacher America has done more to revitalize our schools, particularly in urban areas, than just about anywhere else. And I think we've really got to try something different like that.
I take a Teach for America law clerk almost every year because I find they have good work skills and they're ready to come and work. And so that's not a requirement to be like I said, I take one. But, and I also encourage you to apply for federal law clerkships too, in addition to states. Did you want to comment, or you want to get to?
There's a long line.
Okay, we're going to get to questions now from the audience. I've been instructed that throughout the day they've had some difficulty in hearing the questions. So I would ask that you may state your name or school if you'd like. If you'd like, you're not required to, but please speak distinctly. And I would remind you that there are other people who are lined up, so please don't. This is not the time for your soliloquy on education. It's time for actual questions, and we'll begin over here.
My name is Rachel, and I'm actually not a law student. I'm a private school teacher. So I guess what I'm interested in for asking Judge Bullock is, I'm interested in the educational savings accounts, and I'm wondering the ramifications that they would have for a private school.
So that's a really great question, and thank you for being a private school teacher. Virginia is a state that is considering education savings account legislation very actively, and private school tuition would be one of the things that students could use. So long as the private schools are competitive, and by the way, when I was giving the statistics on Shanghai, American private schools across the board are outperformed substantially there as well. But there's going to be a lot more kids who would be able to afford to go to your school.
Could I?
Hi, I'm Andrew Everett.
Just 1 second. He had a comment, and then it'll be your turn.
Just a couple of points, both addressed in a friendly spirit to Judge Bullock. Number one, in my 30-some-odd years of doing education policy, education reform, et cetera, I have heard a lot of wonderful ideas that made me sit up straight. Experience has taught me that seeing how they work on the ground and having serious evaluations of them is really important before they're generalized. And maybe those studies have been done. I didn't hear you talk about them in any of your.
They're all pretty new.
They're all pretty new. So I think we ought to curb our enthusiasm until the studies vindicate it. Secondly, did I hear you say that that Shanghai outperforms our private schools and not just our public schools?
Yes.
It would seem to follow that the problem then is broader than the system of public education in this country.
Agree.
Okay. Hi, I'm Andrew Everett. I go to school here. Yay. And my question, and actually this is more to the panel at all, or in total, is it seems like not just the issue regarding teachers' unions, not just the requirement of education schools or their predecessors, the normal schools back when that's what they were, but also it seems like, for example, like the school year is effectively the same length as it always was. We have 3 months off in the summer. I mean, it's seemingly we have done nothing to change. And some of these changes don't seem to be, like, for example, altering when the school year is so that we don't leave months off at a time, which is fine if you came from a neighborhood like mine where every parent had the money to send their kid to something cool for the summer. But if you're like from an urban or a less well-off neighborhood, the inability to send their kid to the enriching summer camp or whatever. And what do you think, I guess, and this is a question for the panel as a whole, what do you think are reasonable solutions that we could get passed to actually modernize school systems, such as changing the school year or so on?
I've long been an advocate for that. What you do is you have, it's like 45 days on and then 3 weeks off. And you have enrichment activities, and for kids whose families can afford fancy camps and stuff, they do that too. We have working moms now. It's a pain for working moms to figure out what to do with their kids in the summer. The main barrier to it, contracts, union contracts. And because I was going to comment on the union stuff. There's several bad things about union contracts in this country that other countries don't have. They have unions, but they're more partners. It's the work conditions, and that means you have to negotiate the days of the year and hours of the day. The second thing is the single salary scale, which is a huge impediment, which says, and most unionized school districts, you pay teachers based on their years of service and their credentials, with no accounting of whether they do a good job or not. And yet they want to be a profession, and the average teacher has a master's degree. I don't know what other profession where you have a master's degree you're not evaluated. I've been evaluated my whole life. So it is starting to change, and frankly, even in right-to-work states, the unions have been very effective at getting a lot of these constraints built into state legislation. So it doesn't matter whether you formally have, a union contract or not. And
So you want to roll back the regulation?
I think there has to be. What we need to do is reform unions and reform them from within. And actually, there are that's starting to happen in some places, but when you have the turnover of teachers and of young teachers, they don't rise up in the union structure, and so it's the longest serving union teachers that are controlling the union and controlling the pension systems. That's a whole nother thing, that young teachers pay into these pension systems, and they don't get. They're lucky if they get what they paid in. They don't stay in long enough to vest, and so they're basically underwriting the pensions of the teachers who hang in there for 20 or 30 years. So
And Bill, you have a thank you.
Just very briefly, I think you've asked a good question, and there are two ways we can think about this question. Number one, in fine economist fashion, we can assume a can opener and then sally forth from an imaginary baseline to a utopian conclusion, or we can begin from where we are. Okay? And where we are, to repeat, is that poor kids have one kind of summer experience and rich kids have a very different kind of summer experience. Summer programs frequently enrich the education of well-to-do kids. Long summer vacations typically erode for low income and poor kids a substantial amount of the progress made in the working year. So let's focus our effort on the heart of the problem, and provide extended educational opportunities during 2 of the 3 summer months for poor and low income kids. A number of cities around the country are doing this, and it helps to halt the slippage of educational progress that occurs in those communities. We can do that without blowing up teachers' unions, and we can do it more or less affordably. And we can have a long debate about teachers' unions and reforming them from within, but I've heard this discussion for 2 generations now, and it hasn't happened, and I don't think it's going to. So let's begin from where we are.
And, sir,
Okay.
sorry. I am for trying to work with what we have and not what we wish we had.
Thank you.
That's what I was
And we
just-
appreciate your question very much, and you can visit afterwards. We've
No,
got to.
that's fine. No,
Okay.
And my
Okay, thank
my response was not addressed to you, sir.
Okay, thank you. Okay,
Thank
our
you.
next question.
My name is Bailey. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you have?
No, go ahead.
Okay. My name is Bailey Mitchner. I'm a 2L at Regent Law. I think everyone in this room would agree that the level of a teacher's competence and ability to teach substantially affects a student's ability to learn. I was privileged in the fact I grew up in a high school and a school district where they have a very high criteria for teachers. However, 20 minutes from my high school is a school that is a failing school, and the number of teachers who are not on emergency teaching licenses, so the number of teachers that went to school for teaching, is under 10. So my question is kind of twofold here. First off, and you kind of touched on this with Teach for America, how do you feel about the concept of emergency teaching licenses, and is there really something we can do other than the obvious increasing funding that'll help combat this inequality?
Can I address that? I think there's a lot of stuff going on the ground that people really don't want to talk about. Why can't we get better teachers in general? Why can't we get better teachers in low-income disadvantaged schools? I come from Philadelphia, and it is very hard to get teachers to teach in Philadelphia schools. Why? Because they're chaotic, they're dangerous, they're not pleasant environments. The bureaucratization and the ukases from above about, which hamstring schools and principals and what they can do to enforce disciplinary standards are a constant concern. Who would want to teach in those schools? People don't want to. In a way, you can't pay them enough, right? Their authority is constantly questioned. They're sometimes assaulted. Profanity is hurled at them. I probably shouldn't use that example, considering that happens at Yale too, and nobody does anything about it. But I'll have to come up with a better one. That is the atmosphere. It's not pretty. These are, inconvenient thoughts. The experience of being a teacher in a affluent top school district and a less advantaged school district is a very different one. Now, I have my own ideas about what we can do about that. But I don't think that it has the backing of, a lot of influential key people in society who are really incredibly conflicted about it.
A couple of quick comments, Bailey. You shouldn't have to declare an emergency to hire a competent teacher. And I am a certified teacher in my state of New Jersey. Every minute I spent gaining my certification was a minute I spent away from attaining core competency in the subjects I was teaching or was going to teach. And that is absolutely absurd. So we should take the best graduates and allow them to become teachers rather than shoving people into a school where teaching is an end in itself. The other thing is, I talked about a devolution of authority to the schools. I think that schools should have complete authority to hire and fire their own teachers rather than through a central bureaucracy.
Okay, thank you. Well, our next questioner meets both the state Supreme Court law clerk test, and she's going to be my incoming law clerk.
Awesome.
So, that's
My name is Alexandra Harrison. I'm a graduate of the University of Texas Law School. And in listening to all of the comments today, it sounds like we have a lot of common themes. So the importance of individualized education, reducing bureaucracy, cutting costs, reinforcing training in the working hard and being nice spheres. And at least anecdotally, I think a lot of people in this room experienced one form of education that has not been discussed, namely homeschooling. So my question is homeschooling the heir apparent to the charter school legacy?
No, it's an option. It's an option, but families want their kids to learn in different ways, and we need to have a variety of learning structures where that's possible. I mean, there's, you all obviously are the success stories of homeschooling, and I'm sure there were things your families did to make sure you were socialized and interacted with other young people as you were growing up, and but I do think you don't want to make this an either or. Charter schools have a place. And I think to the previous young woman's questions, charter schools, there are high-performing charter schools that are made up of very large proportions of low-income kids, and they operate in very different ways, and they have different kinds of teachers. So it is possible to, as I think all of us talked about, to do that. But you don't want to have an alternative to charter schools. Heavens.
Well, go ahead.
Can I address this? I think homeschooling's great, and I'm all for it. But I think it has to be a niche phenomenon. And I think the point I'm about to make is one that I think colors every discussion of education, which is what I call the Yale or jail phenomenon, which is that all education, and in fact, sort of the whole society, has to be assimilated to, the best, the brightest, and the most advantaged. And there's a whole world out there of people who, have a lot of social problems and difficulties that it's very hard for people from our insular world to comprehend. Homeschooling requires a home. It requires parents who are educated, are involved, really care, are knowledgeable, are devoted, are dedicated. In the vast majority of cases, we're talking about two-parent families, which are increasingly a rarity. So terrific, but it can't be a model for most of society, right? It just can't be because of the trends, the demographic trends, and the disintegration of the family, which is a lot of what's going on that's in the background here.
I agree that it as homeschooling has traditionally occurred, that there's probably a ceiling on the number of people who can do it. But this is, education savings accounts are the first public policy to address themselves and facilitate homeschooling. And I think what we're going to see if we have this type of public policy is a hybrid type of model where you might go to school 2 days a week or go for chemistry lab or go for football, get your primary training through homeschooling. It may not be in your home. It may be in a neighbor's home. There can be a pooling of resources. And you may work 1 day a week or do a community activity 1 day a week. And that, I think, is what 21st century education ought to look like. If we were and this is how I would go about reforming education. I would start from scratch as if we were creating a school system today without any preconceptions of what a school system should look like. And that will unshackle us and allow us to respond not only to the incredible challenges that we have, but to respond to the incredible opportunities that we have in the 21st century. And it's as if our current system is completely impervious, or almost completely impervious to that.
Thank you. Thank you. Our next question.
Hi, my name is Diana Yuan. I work in New York City, where I also attend Fordham Law School. Judge Bolick, you're a recovering litigator. I am a recovering student of the K-12 notorious New York City educational system, but I'm here now. So, Dr. Galston, you mentioned the correlation of being a high school dropout with the likelihood of incarceration, and something else that is correlated to both is a child being raised in a single-parent divorced household. And Alexandra's question is actually perfectly up to mine, because I want to know whether how exactly should the increase of single-parent household and the diminishing of a strong, mother-father family structure affect education reform?
Well, I didn't mention that in this panel because I talked about it at length in the previous one, and so the first piece of my answer to your question is that it's one of these background conditions that exacerbates the inequalities that exist, that kids bring with them to the very first day of public school. There's just no serious empirical argument about that. And frankly, as a charter member and sometimes the only member of what might be called the pro-family Democratic Caucus, I have scars on my back which will never heal from what I'm about to say, and that is that there are certain gaps that the collapse of the two-parent family lives that cannot be repaired through social policy, whatever it is. It's a permanent deficit for individuals and in our society, which leaves us with an interesting choice. Do we just accept it as a fact of nature and try to work around it, or do we try to do something about it? 20 years ago, it was conventional wisdom that the teen pregnancy rate was not only out of control, but going to stay beyond control forever. That turned out to be false because concerted efforts were made to change not only access to effective programs, but also to change social norms. And to repeat, I think we need a real focus in this country on a national movement to restore, not in an ideological fashion, not pursuant to any particular religious program, but pursuant to common sense and the well-being of children, to restore a marriage culture to the greatest extent that we can. And in the meantime, and this will dovetail with comments that Professor Wax made, there is a mountain of evidence suggesting that, that difficult family circumstances contribute to disciplinary problems that kids bring with them to school, which feeds into the Philadelphia public school syndrome that she so eloquently described, et cetera. And at the very least, and this is why I laid such stress on things that we have to do before kids get to school, through better child care and pre-K education, we can at least begin to socialize these kids so that they're not sent to the principal's office at the age of 5 or 6 on a regular basis.
Can I say something about this? To me, I think yes, it'd be wonderful we could restore marriage culture. We're actually moving quite briskly in the opposite direction. And I agree with Dr. Galston that there is an ineradicable disadvantage or disability that single kids out of single-parent homes are going to experience. It's not just being raised by a single parent, it's the entire social atmosphere in which single parenthood thrives, which is one in which men are just AWOL. They're really not involved in nurturing the next generation. It's terribly sad. We have half the population that has just checked out of building human capital for the next generation. And to me, there's two philosophies. There's a kind of moralistic fallacy. Because we must solve this problem, it follows that we can. I don't think we can. I think this argues, yes, we should do the best we can to create good schools, but we should not engage in these extravagant pie-in-the-sky social engineering initiatives, thinking that we can make up for private failings. That is quintessentially a conservative's point of view, small c, right? Government cannot step into the shoes of individuals and civil society, and government cannot be your father and cannot substitute for a father. I think we need to keep that very clearly in mind. These utopian schemes are a waste of time and money and will just produce frustration. Let's focus on the mission of, creating a good educational system in the conventional sense and recognize that these gaps will never go away. They are self-inflicted wounds.
Thank you all for your comments. My name is Elliot Geiser from the University of Chicago. I'm with 3L. Your just previous comment, Professor Wax, touches on what I was going to ask you about. I agree with you that it's very difficult to create social ecosystems through social engineering. And government can do horrible harm to culture and to destroy things. I think one of the examples of that is how now, since the 60s, the way that we talk about education is in these sterile, socioeconomic, race-based sort of terms rather than talking about it in terms of what we educate kids to do, why we teach them to have a purpose. Substance, about the fact that education is about the soul, and we're beings that are more than matter. And so I'm wondering, what could we do to get the government out of the way? And to you, Justice Bullock, I'm concerned a lot of the people in the homeschooling community, out of which I was educated, are afraid of things like educational savings accounts, because they seem like they'll bring the entangling alliances of the government in and have this sterilization and destruction of the organic familial cultures that are so necessary to a prosperous society.
Do you want to respond?
Sure. That's not an academic concern. When I first started my legal career in the 1980s, among my first pro bono clients were homeschoolers who were being sent to jail for educating their kids at home. This was not an uncommon phenomenon in the early 1980s, so we're not that far removed from that. It's a choice. Basically, the way the programs are designed is to essentially put money into an account, and that account is owned by the family, breaking the connection between the state and the family once the money is deposited there. But any such program has at least the potential to increase government regulation. So there are going to be families that are simply going to say, we're not going to do this. And certainly I would never compel anyone to do it. I think that, and the experience so far has been that families who are choosing to do it are families that are not currently homeschooling, but this empowers them to do it. Is that a net expansion of freedom? No question about it.
Can I say something? Yuval Levin, who is a very wise fellow, has this concept of subsidiarity. And it's the notion that, government works best, all told, if it's closer to the people, if it's closer to the ground, that overweening remote bureaucratic systems are always suspect or, sort of fertile ground for tyranny. And I think our education system is really trying to strike a balance. We've talked today about the localism, the structural localism of school districts, the way that our education system is organized, which is very close to the people, produces inefficiencies. It has many flaws, capture, it's got a lot of negatives. But on the other hand, getting the federal government involved, faraway places, bureaucrats who are not tuned into what people want and what their tastes and preferences are, that also carries a lot of risks. So, I am very sympathetic to your comments about that, and I think striking the balance is difficult. The one more thing I want to say is that we as a society always want to find a procedural solution to what are essentially substantive problems, and that's because it's a lot easier to agree on procedures than it is on what should children be learning, what attitudes should we be imparting, what values, what should they know. We used to be a lot better at that, right? About this was the American way, this is what everybody should know and believe and the like, and we've fractured and fissured as a society. We now have multiculturalism as an important influence. It's very hard to get a consensus, and maybe one of the solutions to that is to maintain a certain degree of localism so that we can have this diversity of viewpoint in a viable way.
Okay, we have time for one more question so we can get out of here on time. I'm sorry for those of you we didn't get to. I do apologize, but we'll have our final question. I want to applaud you for taking your time out today to come here and participate and ask such thoughtful questions.
Thank you. My name is Chris Hollinger, and I'm a 2L at Regent. And I just wanted an interesting closing question here. But Mrs. Brown, to start off with, could you define, excuse me, could you please define equality of opportunity in education? What exactly does that mean if that's the end that we're trying to achieve? And having defined it, could you maybe name a few indicators that we might look at to show that we're making progress in that direction? And how will we know when we have achieved it?
Oh, heavens. I should dig out things I've written in the past about this. Equality of opportunity is, at least in the context of what we're education, is the opportunity to attend a high-quality school as measured by the outcomes for the students. But for disadvantaged kids to achieve those outcomes, they're going to need greater investments. And they just need the opportunity. I'm not saying that if they don't take up the opportunity, that that's the fault of a school or of a family. But so many, I like to focus, you're asking a philosophical question, and I've actually written the answer to that in a little book I wrote a few years ago that I can't even remember exactly how I defined it. Because I
read the book.
Yeah, exactly. I'm more focused on having well-trained teachers for all kids, well-trained teachers in high-poverty schools based on one of the reasons I'm so enthusiastic about evaluations of teachers is we know from research that you cannot look at the years of where they got their education, how long they've been teaching does not translate into being a good teacher. Frankly, the researchers haven't cracked the code, but we do know that paying based on years of service and credentials is just a waste of money, and that we need to evaluate and look at how a teacher's students do. Do they gain? Do they improve? And you just need to get into the nitty-gritty of it all to determine if there really is an equal opportunity. I know that's not a satisfactory answer because you're looking for a more philosophical one, but it's having when you live in, who was talking about interdistrict transfer? You were. Mm-hmm.
I think Bill.
Or Bill. School district, I've been an advocate of that for over 45 years. School districts will not let kids in from the neighboring school district. You look at a state like New Jersey, which is very dense. It has a huge number of school districts. They're bounded by race and income. And right next door, there'll be a high poverty one. And they will not let those kids go to school in the more affluent districts. That's not an equal opportunity.
Okay, we're going to wrap it up, and we're going to give Dr. Galston the last 30 seconds.
Maybe he'll be, he's a professor. He'll
Well,
be more philosophical.
First of all, let me tell you what equal educational opportunity isn't. It's when you have a bunch of kids showing up to kindergarten or first grade years behind their peers. That's not equal educational opportunity. I don't care what kind of school they're going to. So that's point number one. Now let me give you an affirmative answer. And it's a quotation from a fellow by the name of James Truslow Adams, who is the inventor of the phrase and the definer of the phrase, the American dream. Okay? Here's what he said. The dream is of a land in which life should be better and richer and fuller for everyone, with opportunity for each according to ability or achievement. It is a dream of social order in which each man and each woman shall be able to attain to the fullest stature of which they are capable, and to be recognized by others for what they are, regardless of the fortuitous circumstances of birth or position. That's what he wrote almost 100 years ago, and I think it was pretty good then, and it's pretty good now, and it's a pole star for us as a society.
It's a great last word.
Yes, thank you to our panelists.